everyone. Welcome back to the American Experiment podcast. My name is Grace Keating. I'm here with Catherine Hinderacher, and today we are joined by a very special guest, Representative Walter Hudson. Thank you for joining us today.
Glad to be here.
Welcome to the pod.
We are so excited. Now stay tuned because the second half of today's episode is going to feature John Hinderacher sitting down with UMLC Upper Midwest Law Center's James Dickey, and they're going to get into the lawsuit that UMLC just filed over the declaration Walz just put out over the seat vacancy issue, calling for a special election. We might touch on that, I suppose.
We'll get to that later, but it's absolutely crazy. And it's just it's a relief that we finally have good news. We have like an infrastructure in Minnesota to deal with issues like this quickly, act on things that come up. I mean, it's optimistic no matter what happens with
Thank God for UMLC. Always thank God for UMLC. Yeah. So stay tuned for that. For now, I mean, if you guys were watching last week, we did kind of a big overview on all this crazy stuff that's happening in the legislature, even months after the election. Today, we're going to focus more on the House and what's happening with that mess.
I think what we should do is launch into the main thing that's happened since last week, which is specifically on one election in the House. Walter, from your perspective, will you just take us through some of the backstory here? Republicans and Democrats in the House were at a 67 tie after November's election. What has happened since, specifically with that seat in 40B?
Well, I think first of all, in order to accurately understand it, we should understand that we perceived that we were at a 67 tie after Election Day because we were not yet aware of the issues in certain races.
The 20 ballots run away.
That's a great way of putting it.
For one.
Correct. So this idea, because what you're seeing right now, especially on social media, is Democrats coming out with this unified message of Minnesota elected a tied House. Well, we literally do not know that.
Yeah.
Because we have this one race in Shakopee between Aaron Paul and Brad Tapke, where, as you stated, at minimum, 20 ballots that we know of were tossed in the garbage can, which... How does that happen?
You can't even make it up.
Okay. There's a 14-point margin of victory, or 14-vote margin of victory. Mm-hmm. And so that right there, onto itself, is enough reason to call into question the reported outcome of the race. Mm-hmm. But then you add on top of that, there are at least 30 duplicate voter history records. So folks who were recorded as having voted twice. Mm-hmm. Now, whether or not that translated to multiple ballots being entered into the tally is to be determined, but it certainly raises a lot of strange questions, right? And so the current election contest is focused on those 20 missing ballots and whether or not that situation can be reconciled. And what the Democrats and some county officials in Scott County have been trying to put forward as a defense is, well, we think we know who these 20 people were.
Right.
Yeah.
And based on our theory of who these 20 people were, we brought in 12 of them.
Yeah, Bill was talking about this last week. They brought people in and said, on the record, tell us who did you vote for?
Right.
As if that is some sort of legitimate, way of voting.
Right.
To make them say on record who they voted for retrospectively. I mean, that seems absurd to me, but we're waiting for a decision from a judge. Is that right?
Correct. So a quick note, it is against established legal precedent to determine an election in that manner. Because think about the whole concept of a secret ballot. Why do we even have a secret ballot?
If you can just be called upon at any time to give
to reveal how you voted. And then also think about the danger that poses in terms of manipulation. What could you be offered or threatened with in order to come in and say, I voted this way or I voted that way?
I didn't even think of that.
Yeah.
And this is a question that has been considered by the court in the past, and that's why the established precedent is such that we don't do it this way.
Yeah.
Right? So the court is looking at that case. A ruling has yet to be offered, but ultimately the final arbiter under the state constitution of how this gets resolved is the Minnesota House of Representatives. We determine our own membership. And so whatever the court says, we ultimately have to review it. And so the idea, this is all in flux, the idea that you could go out there and say definitively as a matter of fact that Minnesota elected a tied legislature, it is objectively false. And it is a tactic that I would put very close to election interference.
And while we're talking about this issue, we talked about the ability you guys have in the House to not seat Brad Tabke, right? If he were to say, the court says, oh, this is fine, we're not going to do another election. What do you think of that idea of not seating someone? Are you for it? Are you against it? You have to see what the court says.
Well, so I think what it actually is, I mean, it sounds kind of like arbitrary when you say we're going to not seat him. What it is we're going to review the court's finding, right?
Sure.
Like the court's going to make a ruling, and as the House, we're going to review their finding and determine whether or not we agree with it, and then we get to decide what the membership of our House is.
Sure.
Yeah. So if we don't seat him, it's not because I don't like Brad, right? It's because there are these findings of fact that have been adjudicated that provide us with just cause to ensure that the people of that district are represented accurately, that every vote counts, which in my opinion and a lot of people's opinion is going to require a new election.
Right. So then let's maybe move on to the other issue that has come up in the last week, which is with the guy who actually didn't live in the district he was elected to represent. So now the court, agreed with the Republican Party. They said clearly this guy didn't live there, and there will be another election. And like we said, James Dickey will talk later on about kind of the specifics about what's going to happen. Walz quickly called an election, a special election. It might not have been legal, so we'll let him talk about that. But how have Republicans and Democrats responded to the results of that court decision?
Well, that's the court decision that actually placed us in the position where we are in the majority now, because he was the 67th. And so they now have only 66 elected members of the House, which has all kinds of implications that we may or may not get into. But we are in the majority right now. We are, as a caucus, as a House Republican caucus, we are proceeding as a majority because that's our status.
Yeah.
Democrats are playing a lot of interesting rhetorical games. So they're trying to pretend, first of all, Melissa Hortman, which I was stunned by yesterday, came out on a press conference at the Capitol and said that she believes that the court was wrong and that this guy actually lived in the district. So apparently Melissa Hortman thinks that this dude actually does not turn on his light when he comes home to his apartment.
Or never open his door.
Right.
Like,
do they have tape on the door?
He never opened it.
This is a pretty closed case. I mean, holy cow.
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, because what else is she going to say?
I suppose.
Yeah,
we do.
That's true.
Because their whole narrative of it's funny because they tried to echo, because yesterday was January 6th, and that's when these press conferences happen.
Never forget.
Yes, exactly. the most deadliest of days. They try to echo that and tie this to that, and Republicans are seizing power, and this is illegitimate, and they're trying to overthrow the will of the voters and all these things. That narrative, absurd as it is on its face, can only be maintained by other lies and misinformation, such as, I didn't know he didn't live there, or I think he, or actually that's not what she said. It's not that she claims she didn't know. What she said was, to this day, she still believes he did live there, which is even more absurd than the idea that she didn't know.
The idea that this is a power grab from Republicans is what is so interesting to me, the way that they're trying to twist this narrative, because clearly they are upset that they have lost power. They are the ones on the Democratic side who are upset that they no longer have the trifecta because they broke a law. They broke a law, and now they have to face the consequences.
Yes.
And they're saying that is a Republican power grab. That is insane to me. It's like classic liberal logic. Yes, we did break the law, but there should not be consequences.
Yeah.
What did you think was going to happen? That is the narrative that is crazy to me, and I think it's important that we dispel that is clearly incorrect, that it's a Republican power grab.
Yes, I did the carjacking, but it's because Republicans didn't fund public education.
Yeah,
Right.
That's the argument,
Yeah.
right? It's like it's always the Republicans' fault for what I actually did.
Yeah.
So now, what else did Melissa Hortman say at that press conference?
So
Yesterday, I believe it was.
this is just mind-numbing to me, okay? So I heard this rumor, and a lot of us have been hearing this rumor and didn't talk about it publicly because we didn't think it could be true. We thought it was too absurd. to actually be possible. And the rumor was that the Democrats were mulling around the idea of not showing up for work on the first day of session next Tuesday on the 14th.
I, too, mull around that idea every once in a while in the morning in bed. Should I go to work today? Should I not?
And yesterday, quite shockingly, not only did Melissa Hortman say that that is, in fact, their plan, that they're not going to show up, she characterized it as a labor strike and actually used the term out on the picket line. We'll be out walking the picket line.
And she said there better not be scabs. Like that was, she threatened her own. That was my favorite part, honestly. Like, and we will not have scabs. She kind of looks around like, oh my God.
And I'm just, I couldn't have, like, I should send her a thank you note. Like, I could not have crafted the message better than she did for us yesterday. Gosh. It's absolutely insane.
I have like so many questions. I think the key one is I still don't necessarily understand what they are hoping to achieve. I think is the heart of the question like this issue of quorum. Do you think the Democrats sincerely believe that you will not have a quorum when the session starts? Because to me, it seems clear that you will have a quorum. But are they arguing that you won't?
Yeah, they are arguing that we won't. And there's a lot of interesting things in play here. So first of all, obviously, this is an attempt to run out the clock so that they can get through the special elections, which they're hoping they're going to win. They're assuming that they're going to win. I mean, they're talking about it as if it's already been determined. Yeah. Like we should just legislate as if we've already won. Gosh. Which, boy, I'd love to have that deal. Right? Like I'm already the king. I'm already the winner. So I should just be able to do whatever I want.
Yeah.
So that's one aspect of it. The other thing is this quorum issue. Yeah. Right. So historically, there have been examples of a Speaker of the House in Minnesota being elected with just 67 votes, which is what we currently have.
Okay.
All right, because you can't pass a bill constitutionally. You can't pass a bill without 68 votes.
Right.
But you can engage in certain parliamentary procedures, including electing the Speaker of the House with just 67 votes. But we can't do that without first establishing a quorum. Okay. Now, historically, a quorum has always been 68. But here's the thing. The reason it's been 68 is that 68 is a majority of 134.
Oh, my gosh.
Yeah.
We currently don't have 134. We have 133. And the way it's stated in the Constitution is that a quorum is a majority of members elected.
Yeah.
Not a majority of members presumed in the future.
Yeah.
Not a majority of members hypothetically.
Yeah.
A majority of members elected.
And in this context, it doesn't use the number 68, right? It just says a majority.
Correct.
So who does it fall to decide this? Is it the Secretary of State? I mean, when do we get an answer on
that?
Well,
and that's the other part of this that's really interesting, right? Is that on the 14th, the initial proceedings are going to be presided over by the Secretary of State, Steve Simon, who, of course, is a partisan Democrat, right? So in his role, which is typically very ceremonial, in his role, he has the ability to declare as the presiding officer that a quorum has not been reached.
Okay.
So he's the one who gets to determine whose interpretation of this language in the Constitution is correct.
We'll see. Because the presiding officer is like if you've ever been to any sort of parliamentary body, a political convention or something along those lines, a city council.
I tried to avoid them, but yeah.
Yeah. The presiding officer is not the king of the body. The presiding officer is there to fulfill the will of the body. And so if we decide as a body to override what the presiding officer says, then he's in a position where he either has to uphold the will of the body or decide that he has unconstitutional authority to wield as Secretary of State.
Interesting. So you could essentially vote to disagree with him?
Yes.
Okay.
That answer.
And by the way, we can do that we can do that with the Speaker at any point throughout our parliamentary. Like you can always say, I motion to overrule the ruling of the Speaker, and you get a vote on that.
So then to me, it's still unclear what the Democrats think they are going to gain from the boycott if ultimately you will still be able to elect a Republican speaker why are they doing this? What do you think? Like, what are they going to gain from this?
Well, they probably have multiple contingencies, just like we have multiple contingencies. And I think what they're hoping for first is that they'll be able to, with the assistance of Simon, strong arm us into not being able to organize, and then be able to win that public opinion and or legal battle that results out of that, or at least keep the ball in the air long enough that, again, they can postpone any outcome until these special elections have been resolved. So it's all about deflect, defer, block until such time as we can win. Like that's kind of their thought process.
But if history repeats itself, like I was thinking of, this has happened before in various circumstances. The one I remember is the Texas Democrats a couple years ago who fled the state. Do you remember this? They were against, I think it was like an election law or something. And they fled the state and then live tweeted they're fleeing and were, acting very oppressed as people who have fled the state. And the tweets are hilarious. I got to go back and dig them up. Yeah. But it was a PR nightmare for the Democrats in Texas. It didn't go over well. They didn't accomplish anything. I think they held out for a month or something insane. And they really didn't accomplish much in the end. So it's just interesting to me that they think the Democrats in Minnesota think that this is their best course of action.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to work out well for them at all for a couple of reasons. First of all, it completely blows apart their rhetoric regarding wanting to work with us, right? You can't claim on the one hand that you're willing to work across the aisle with Republicans in the House and at the same time say, but we're only going to do it if you give up your constitutional authority. You have to, we're only going to do it if you don't have any power, if we go to this quote unquote power sharing agreement, which was negotiated entirely contingent upon the tie. So it's a bad faith argument, and it signals the fact Ryan Winkler was on X the other day mocking us for, in his view, wasting time and money on this because you guys can't do anything without 68 votes anyway, which is an admission that they have no intention of working with us. Right? Yeah. So that's one thing that's not going to go their way, is to the extent that they try to pretend, as Melissa Hortman did yesterday, that they're actually, we're just so eager to get down to work with Republicans and work on bipartisan legislation, when your actions betray the fact that your intentions are otherwise. So that doesn't work for them. The other thing that I don't think works for them is public perception of the idea that they're somehow going to be supported by the public in this action. Melissa Hortman said yesterday that, we're still going to be working even though we're not at work. We're still going to be working because we're going to be in the district meeting with firefighters and mayors. And if I'm one of those firefighters or mayors in the districts that they represent, my question to you is, why aren't you at work?
Right.
Go to the Capitol.
What is the utility?
What's happening?
Right. Why should I? What is the point in me talking to you about what I want to see come out of the legislature when you're not at the legislature?
Yeah.
Right. So I don't think it's going to rub people the right way. The idea that this is some sort of righteous stand against insurrectionists, when in point of fact, all we're doing is upholding the law, upholding the Constitution, and defending voters to ensure that they've been accurately represented.
Yeah, I think it's really hurting them that they still want to get paid, too. I think that blows so many holes in their idea of, we're sacrificing so much for this. This is a strike, boycott, whatever they want to call it. It's really not if you're still getting paid for work that you're not doing. I think that's going to hurt them with a lot of people.
Yeah, it's one thing to take a day off, a paid vacation. It's another thing to act like it's some sort of sacrifice.
Yeah.
It just does not jive.
The thing that Republicans have brought up, if they go through with this, is the potential for recall elections. Do you think, is that a serious threat from Republicans?
100%.
Do you think that is something that could be likely?
100%. I think each and every Democrat in the House should expect to be recalled if they don't show up for work.
Okay, I looked up, I didn't know what it takes for a recall off the top of my head. It's only 25% of the people who voted in the last election to elect that person. So to me, that's not a huge chunk. At first I thought 25%, of the population of your district, that's a huge chunk. No, it's people who voted. So I think that's super interesting. It's not as hard to get a recall, it seems to me, just reading that, as I maybe thought.
No.
Oh, sorry. Who initiates a recall? I did want to ask that. It's citizens,
so
right?
I know that it involves a petition that goes to the court. Okay. And the court decides whether or not there is grounds And then once the grounds have been established by the court, then you can go and collect your signatures.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So the grounds in this case would be nonfeasance.
Not working.
Yes. And Hortman tried to address that because a reporter correctly asked her about it in the press conference yesterday. And she's like, well, it's not nonfeasance because firefighters and mayors, right? Like we're doing the job we define that we should be doing. We're gonna be in our offices working on bills. It's like, no, your job as dictated in statute is to be in session.
Right. You don't get
not to be out doing something
when
else.
You go in. Yeah.
Now members, there are such a thing as excused absences, but in order to have an excused absence, there has to be a house organized in the first place. And you have explicitly said that the purpose of not showing up is to prevent the house from being organized.
Right.
That is nonfeasance.
Yeah. I do want to give you a chance to talk about, I know the Republican platform was released, or at least some of your to-do list was released recently. I want to give you a chance to talk about that a little bit, kind of your priorities going into the session, and then how likely is it that you're going to be able to accomplish things like you mentioned? You still need 68 votes to pass a bill, right? So how optimistic are you? Are things going to be able to get done? How much does it help to have the speaker and some of those committee leadership roles? Talk about that, if you would.
Yeah, well, I'm much less optimistic now that I'm seeing how childishly the Democrats are entering the legislative session. I mean, they are not entering this session in the spirit of cooperation and with a spirit of humility, which they really should have, right? Like, you had the majority, you have lost it. By any measure, you lost it.
Right.
That's a repudiation from the people of Minnesota. You should be walking with humility, and instead they're walking the picket line, right? And so that makes me less optimistic that we're going to be able to work with them even once this smoke clears. Just because they're acting in bad faith. However, our priorities and things like looking at the fraud and doing something meaningful about it, providing accountability to state agencies, making Minnesota safe, getting bad actors, violent criminals off the street, ensuring that we're providing fair and flexible funding to schools, our school districts. I was at a school district event in my area last night, and it's every educator, administrator, student that I talk to recognizes that the historic funding that was passed last term with 65 new mandates is not cutting it. It's not doing the job. So we will certainly have bills and committee hearings on all of those things. The question is, will there be enough political pressure? Because right now, like when Melissa Hortman looks over both shoulders and worries about scabs, what she's worried about is Democrats in tight districts whose voters are going to be looking at them, expecting them to actually get something done.
Well, didn't some of them come out and say that they're like a blue dog caucus or something?
That was in the Senate. That was in the Senate.
That was in the Senate. Okay.
Yeah. So, and that's the other, there's a whole other list of interesting things happening in the Senate. But yeah, I mean, look, Democrats are smart, and I mean not the party as a whole, but specific members in these chambers. If they're smart, then they will work with us. Yeah. If they're smart, then they will work to get something done. And if Governor Walz is smart, he'll sign some of the legislation that gets passed in bipartisan fashion. There's a lot of ifs there.
Yeah.
And a lot of evidence that they may not be willing to do any of it. But regardless, no matter how intransigent the Democrats are, we're going to be bringing solutions to the people of Minnesota. And if the Democrats want to vote it down, then they can explain themselves in 2026.
Yeah, I think this has brought a lot of optimism to me, at least just seeing the people who I think are fighting for my conservative values, the conservative values we talk about here at the center, to see Republicans standing up like Lisa Demuth and saying, we're not going to have a power sharing agreement. We have the majority, It's like this kind of fight that we have wanted, I think, in Minnesota for the values we care about. We've wanted this fight from our represented leaders for so long, and we're finally getting it. And that's optimistic. If you carry that through the whole session, I think that it will bring a lot of optimism to our side of the aisle. So thank you for everything you're doing. And thank you for coming on the podcast today, Representative Hudson.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Stick around, guys. Stay tuned for the second half of this episode with James Dickey and John Hinderaker, and we'll see you next week. American Experiment is supported by thousands of individuals like you. To join the movement, go to www.americanexperiment.org and click the yellow donate button. From all of us here, thank you.
Welcome to the American Experiment podcast. I'm here today with James Dickey, Senior Trial Counsel at the Upper Midwest Law Center. James, thanks for being with us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, John. Good to be here.
James, you have commenced a case in the Minnesota Supreme Court, and that's what we want to talk about today. But before we get to the case, let's just back up for a moment and set the stage, because all of this controversy arises out of an election for a seat in the Minnesota House of Representatives and a subsequent election contest. Just describe, what was that all about?
So Curtis Johnson won the most votes in November in the Roseville and Shoreview House District 40B election. But the problem with that is that he didn't live there. And so Paul Wickstrom, who was the candidate who ran against him from the Republican Party, brought an election contest in court. And a judge, after hearing 300 exhibits of testimony and days of testimony, agreed. You didn't live there. You're ineligible under the Constitution to serve in that capacity. And so you can't hold that seat. So
under Minnesota law, you have to physically reside in the district where you run for at least 6 months before the election, right?
The Constitution requires that.
And the facts here are actually kind of funny almost, because this DFL candidate rented an apartment within the district, but he clearly never moved into it. He continued to live in his old house outside the district. He never even turned on the electricity in this rented apartment, and he just got caught red-handed cheating.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, the judge said, as the judge noted, the evidence was pretty overwhelming, and Paul Wickstrom's team did a lot of work to put together all this evidence after they had been told by someone, hey, your guy doesn't live in the district.
And so the judge issued a very strong order that actually enjoins this DFL candidate from taking a seat in the Minnesota House of Representatives, which is very important because following the 2024 election, it looked like the Minnesota House was going to be tied 67-67. But with this seat not being filled by that DFL candidate, when they convene on January 14th, it looks like it's going to be 67-66.
It will be. It'll be a one-vote majority for the Republicans.
And that has got various consequences that I think we've talked about in a different podcast. So now I want to jump ahead and talk about the case that you have pending in the Minnesota Supreme Court. And you filed a petition? What was the pleading?
Yeah, so this is a petition, and there's a Minnesota law with relation to election contests and issues related to what's on the ballot. It's really important, as the legislature has recognized, to correct the errors as fast as possible. So with a case like this, where you have a state legislative office, you file a petition in the Minnesota Supreme Court that says in this case, Governor Walz issued a writ illegally, calling a special election, and an election can't happen, but you got to do it quickly, and you got to go straight to the Supreme Court.
So let's talk about that. So the DFL obviously is anxious to have a special election and hope that they win it, of course,
right,
and get that seat filled. And so the predicate for all of this, as I understand it, is that DFL candidate who never took office. These people who got elected in November are going to take office in January, later this month. But that guy never did take office as a member of the Minnesota House. So he purported to resign from a seat which he never held. And in fact, somebody else held that seat.
Yeah, that's right.
The person who was elected 2 years ago is the incumbent and will be the incumbent until the new legislature meets. And so that, again, it's almost humorous the way they have tried to finesse this.
I mean, it's Jamie Becker Finn, at the time in December 27th, when the governor issued the writ, she was the incumbent in the seat. So there was no vacancy in the seat. And you can't, as a governor, you cannot issue a writ of election when there's no vacancy.
So Governor Tim Walz issued the writ, as you described, and what he's doing here is trying to schedule a special election at the earliest possible date. Is that what this is all about?
That's what it seems like.
And under that writ, what would happen?
Well, if the writ were properly issued, it would be issued 22 days after the beginning of the session. So Wednesday, February 5th would be the earliest date it could be issued. Unless, of course, the legislature gets together, they get a quorum, they elect a speaker, and they pass a resolution saying, go ahead and call a special election 5 days from the first day of session. That's the earliest time at which there could be a proper writ issued, and it could be a proper special election.
So let's delve into the legalities here,
Sure.
because obviously you are taking the position in the Minnesota Supreme Court that the writ issued by Tim Walz was illegal, improper, not compliant with Minnesota statutes. Is there a Minnesota law that deals generally with this whole subject of special elections?
There is a Minnesota law 204D.19 that applies to several different situations in which a special election could be required. But there is a specific subdivision of that statute that applies only when a vacancy results from a successful election contest.
Which is exactly what we have here.
Right. If this is not the case for that law has been written out of the statute books.
So the Minnesota statutes provide there's a section that's got multiple subdivisions,
Yes.
and each subdivision addresses a different situation in which the need for a special election could arise.
Correct.
Right?
Yes.
And one of those subdivisions deals specifically with a special election that is necessary because of a successful election contest.
Right.
Which is exactly what we have here.
Exactly.
And so a lawyer would normally say, well, that's the section that applies. Was that the section that Tim Walz followed in issuing his alleged writ?
Well, as usual, with most, similar to Governor Walz's COVID orders, which kind of recite a bevy of different statutes without being specific as to which one they're really relying on. And in this case, the writ just says we're relying on all these different special election statutes and statutes related to resignations and vacancies, very broadly stated, not really taking care to explain why they're using this statute or anything like that. And so as far as we can tell, because they haven't responded to the petition yet, and they have to respond no later than Friday, January 10th, as far as we can tell, he's trying to rely on the statute, the subdivision of this statute that relates to resignations. But you have to have a legitimate resignation.
Yeah, presumably, this is why they got the guy who got the most votes, but who didn't live in the district to quote resign, close quote, from a seat,
which is like saying
which he never held.
It's like after you get fired, saying I quit, right?
So apparently they're trying to invoke that statute. But what's the difference? I mean, on any scenario here, there is at some point going to be a special election. And it's going to be after the House convenes on January 14 and elects a speaker. So what kind of a difference are we ultimately talking about?
Well, I think the most important thing, and the reason why this lawsuit was brought, is because the rule of law must be followed. The parties, Republican Party, Democrat Party, they rely on the governor to follow the letter of the law when it comes to calling an election. And that's what we have an affidavit that supports our petition talking about, that the Republican Party, for example, believed that there would be a writ calling for a special election issued 22 days after the beginning of the legislative session, or at some earlier time, once the parties all came together and agreed that there wouldn't be a further review of the election contest. Parties rely on that kind of information to gather nominating conventions, to figure out what candidates they want to put forward, to figure out their messaging, to figure out their strategies related to elections. And it's improper for a governor of either party, Republican or Democrat, to just say, we have all the information on our side. They don't know anything. We're just going to go ahead and have this resignation and writ issued ASAP, one after another, just like that. And then, surprise, there's going to be an election in less than 30 days.
So basically, the substantive issue is around giving the parties time enough to get organized for the special election.
I think that's why the legislature has created a statutory system that sets up a time in which this would happen. If the legislature wanted, after a special election contest, the writ to be issued immediately, as soon as the judge issued a decision, and if the legislature said that was binding, I'm not sure if that could be the case under separation of powers, but if they wanted to do that, they could certainly write a law that says that. But the courts have to interpret and enforce the law as they're written, not as they think maybe they should be.
Yeah. And so you filed the petition. Was it just yesterday or Friday? When did you file it?
It was Saturday. Okay. Working on a weekend.
All right.
For the record.
So you filed your petition in the Minnesota Supreme Court on Saturday, and I believe they have scheduled a hearing. Is that right?
Yes. January 15th at 10 a.m. There's going to be a hearing in this case.
And in the meantime, the governor, the state, somebody is going to file a responsive brief.
Yep. I expect the state to file a response, and I expect Ramsey County, which has, election officials and Ramsey County itself actually hosts the election, if you will. So I expect them to file a response on Friday, January 10th.
One thing we didn't talk about is who are the parties to this lawsuit. We kind of jumped in. But let's talk about who the parties are. You obviously representing the plaintiffs or the petitioners in the lawsuit. Who are they?
So we represent, Upper Midwest Law Center represents Minnesota Voters Alliance and the two individual residents of House District 40B who they say, we want to have our seat filled, but we want it according to law because we believe the law has to be followed. The Republican Party of Minnesota is also a petitioner. They're represented separately by the Cross Castle Law Firm and Ryan Wilson. On the other side of the case, you've got Governor Tim Walz, because he's the one who issued the writ. Steve Simon filed the writ and has certain duties related to special elections that he oversees as Secretary of State. And then the Ramsey County officials are really the county auditor who's charged with certain duties under statute, the elections manager who takes care of things delegated from the county auditor, and the county itself, because the county itself really is the one hosting the election. So those are the parties in the case on both sides. And the candidates to this election have been personally served with notice of it, but they don't necessarily, they can file a brief if they want to, but they don't have to. They're not parties to it because they're not actually being, the court's not going to issue an order related to them. It's just going to be their election doesn't happen right away.
Right. So one or more of those defendants will be filing a response by when?
No later than Friday at 4 p.m.
And then the hearing will be on the 15th, and presumably the Supreme Court will issue its order soon thereafter.
In these situations, the way I see it happening, typically the court will issue an order very quickly after the actual hearing itself, with an opinion to follow. And the opinion might be 3 or 4 months later, but an order will issue. Historically speaking, in the last year, we've had another recall election in Columbia Heights that was canceled on February 9th when the election took place on February 13th. So I could see the court waiting up until maybe a few days before the election to issue an order, but it'll be pretty quick.
So we'll have to wait until they file their pleadings to see exactly what their position is, although it sounds pretty clear to me that, and I've read your papers, that this writ was not issued properly with the right timing under the subdivision of that section that actually applies. Governor Walz was quoted, I think, in the newspapers saying something to the effect that you or the Republicans were trying to prevent DFL legislators from being seated. What's your comment on that?
This lawsuit was filed to uphold the rule of law. I wouldn't care if it was Tim Pawlenty who issued a legal writ. I'd still be happy to bring that lawsuit. But furthermore, it's kind of presumptuous, isn't it? I mean, we haven't had an election yet. What Democrat legislator?
Yeah, he's assuming that when this election is held, and it's not too far off, it'll be February probably, or
I think so,
sometime pretty soon. He's assuming that the DFL candidate, we don't even know who that is yet, by the way.
Yeah.
This unknown, unnamed DFL candidate surely is going to win that election. It seems like a rather presumptuous public statement for the governor to make.
And historically speaking, there have been election contests before, and one of the most prominent examples was a guy named Pavlik who got thrown out of the House after an election contest and ran for his seat again in the special election and lost. And why? Because voters hold people accountable.
So he won the first time, got the most votes the first time, but then it got thrown out on an election contest. He said, okay, well, we'll do it again. The second time he lost.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it.
And so one possibility here is that the voters, well, for one thing, it's never going to be exactly the same group of voters who turn out.
Exactly.
Right? A special election is different. It's likely to have fewer voters. Donald Trump won't be on the ballot, and Kamala Harris won't be on the ballot. Mm-hmm. And so it'll be a different subset of the population that turns out for the special election. Could very well be a different result. And there could be some voters who say, hey, I'm not happy with the fact that the DFL party cheated to try to win that election last November. This is just blatant cheating on the part of the DFL candidates. Some voters might not like that, and it might influence their votes.
Yeah, I mean, this is not, and this is, however you want to look at judges' partisan leanings and things like that. As I understand it, the judge in this case was appointed by a Democrat, in the election contest was appointed by a Democrat governor. And, you have someone who clearly doesn't have any partisan leanings against the Democrat candidate who saw the mountain of evidence. And the people who are paying attention are the ones who normally vote in special elections, as I kind of see it. they're the ones who would know about this election contest, and they know that the candidate who he intended maybe to live there after he got elected, but had made no effort
Although
whatsoever.
even that is dubious. So there's no evidence for that proposition.
Well, the evidence is he said, she said, right? And it's not very strong.
But in any event, it's not the standard. You have to live there for 6 months before the election.
Yeah, and that's the law. And again, did the people vote for that person? Yes. Was he eligible to receive those votes? No. Why? Because the law says he's not. It's how it is. We're a nation and a state of laws, not of men and women.
So we're going to follow this case very, very closely. And we're also going to be following, of course, the opening of the 2025 session of the Minnesota legislature, which is in turmoil for a number of reasons. We got a DFL senator going on trial for first-degree burglary later this month. We've got this situation where what would have been a tie if there had been a legitimate election. And was it 40B?
40B, yeah.
Instead, that seat is going to be open pending the special election. It's going to give the Republicans presumably a 1-vote majority and allow them to elect a Speaker of the House.
It should. I mean, there have been 67-vote Speaker elections in the past, so it should be enough for a Speaker.
So there's going to be a lot to follow here in the days and weeks to come, and I'm sure we will be checking back with you at some point, James, to see how this case is proceeding and how it ultimately turns out.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Thanks for being with us.
Thanks, John. Thanks for your time.